Well, benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 33 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this lecture is fraternal correction, and I am Dr. Thibault. So we are jumping into the third and final exterior act of charity. We've covered beneficence, alms deeds, and now fraternal correction. Prior to this, we covered the interior acts of charity. So if you want to see any of those videos, they are available for you. This one's 8 articles, so we'll just jump right in. So fraternal correction, is it an act of charity? And St. Thomas says, yes, it is an act of charity because it is part of the spiritual works of mercy, right? To admonish the sinner is a fraternal correction. And in a very practical way, it's harm to self and harm to others, right? So this is why we would correct one another. But true fraternal correction is correcting people who are going to harm themselves. This is the primary purpose of fraternal correction. So if a person is harming themselves through their sin, through their actions, then we should correct them, because to correct is to remove the evil and to replace it with good. So in some ways, doing fraternal correction is to put goodness in your brother, right? To give goodness to your brother. Therefore, it is an act of charity, right? This is not to admonish somebody in order to be a bully or to feel good about this ourselves, but to do good for the sake of the brother, right, or sister, right? To do good for the sake of the other. Now, the other way of looking at it is if there is damage done that needs correcting, which affects the common good. So if a brother is withholding wages from their workers, right, this is harming others, right? It is both a sin on the brother himself, but it is also a harm to others. This is correcting him in that regard would be more a matter of justice than charity, right? To the degree that he's harming himself, it's charity. To the degree that he's harming others, there is now an element of justice, giving to those which is due, right? If he's withholding that which is due, then justice is required. You can still act justly with charity, right? So if you are giving what is due to the worker, that's justice. If you're doing it because you love the workers, right? Because you love your neighbor who are workers, now it is justice done with charity. It's even better. But purely speaking, if a person is injuring themselves through their sin, let's say they're not married, they're a single person, they're a functional alcoholic, for example, but they're doing damage to themselves through their drinking, then it's not a matter of justice that you're getting involved. It is simply a matter of charity. We can then ask, is fraternal correction a matter of precept? Is this a precept? Right? Is there a law about it? Now, St. Thomas, he doesn't jump into the Old Testament or anything like that. He's using a lot of the authority of St. Augustine. St. Augustine says, you become worse than that of a sinner if you fail to correct him. So that's a strong precept from St. Augustine. In some ways, there's we have direct commands, usually in the form of prohibition. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet, thou shalt not kill. Right? There's, of all of the law, there are far more laws telling us what not to do, right? How not to violate the law. There's far less precepts telling us what we ought to do. There are some, right? Honor your mother and your father, right? Honor the Sabbath, right? These types of things are positive, but there's far more direct commands towards prohibition. So this being a matter of correct your brother, it's more of an indirect precept. So if your brother is stealing, killing, committing adultery, right? Since there are direct precepts against doing those things, the positive side for fraternal correction would be saying, telling him not to do those things, right? It's not direct, right? It's not direct. St. Thomas also points out, using St. Augustine, he says, charity should guide our feelings that we wish to be saved, right? Charity. So why do we do these things? Why do we help our brother when he's sinning? It's not my soul that he's destroying. He's destroying his own. Why should I care? Because of charity, right? Charity should guide our actions. It should guide our feelings. It should guide the way in which we engage in the world. So certainly, charity should define our relationship with our neighbor. So therefore, we are bound by charity to act, right? You don't just sit back and allow somebody to destroy themselves, right? You should act. There are 3 exceptions, St. Thomas points out. Sometimes it is better not to admonish right away, but to wait for a better time. Or if you have a legitimate fear that by admonishing, you might actually just make it worse, right? You see this sometimes in something like an episode of Hoarders, for example. If a person's not being supportive, if they just start yelling at the woman, it's usually a woman, but sometimes men, right? Yelling at the woman, just throw it all away, just throw it all away. And what's the response? Well, just throw me away with my stuff, I don't even want to live, right? So is yelling at the woman, just throw it all away, helpful? It's not helpful. Well, what does the woman need to do? She needs to throw it all away, right? She needs to throw it all away, but yelling that at her at a very vulnerable time does not accomplish what you hope to do. Usually the most effective people in those situations when like a grandchild comes over and goes, Grandma, I want to spend time with you. I want to spend time at your house. You're doing so good. Can I help you? And then the grandmother ends up having a softer disposition and is able to get rid of more things than the daughter who's just, grew up in this mess and is just furious and is screaming, right? That doesn't always help, right? And sometimes it's better to wait for a time, right? So if you see something, sometimes you go, oh, okay, mark that down. We'll have a chat about that later, right? That's whenever you're in religious life and your superior, especially when you're in formation, your superior looks at you and takes out a notebook and takes a note. You always go, oh, I'm going to hear about that, right? You can expect it. Another thing you can do, why you might not admonish right away, is by doing so you commit a mortal sin, right? So like the daughter who's screaming at the mother, just throw it all away, right? Well, are you acting out of charity when you say that? Right? Are you acting in a loving way? Or are you acting out of anger and frustration? And are you, in your own sense of pride? How much of this is saying in front of the cameras, I'm not like you, right? Oh, we have the command, the precept of honoring our mother and father, screaming at our mother and father on TV and embarrassing them. It's not honoring, right? So, and by that, admonishing, the person might actually be committing a sin themselves. Right? Lastly, if it's a venial sin, and it can be overlooked, right? And this one, St. Thomas points out, could be done by holy people, right? Holy people. And I used this example before, but I think St. Therese, sitting close to the nun that used to drive her crazy, we used to rub her rosary beads, and it was really annoying, right? She could have said, Sister, what you're doing is really annoying to the rest of the community. Right? But instead, she took it as an opportunity to show charity, to bear wrongs patiently, right? That's another one of those spiritual works of mercy, and to overlook it, right? It's not a mortal sin. The person's soul is not at risk for doing it. Sometimes it's better just to accept it, right? In the monastery, maybe there's a monk who always rushes to the front of the line to grab the food first, and maybe they take more than they should, or something. You could admonish the person, right? Some type of fraternal correction. Or you can learn to laugh and show some charity and realize that's just how the person is, and it's not a big deal, right? Right? There can be personal grace in accepting this. Now, as we looked at with justice, which is in the future actually for you guys, if it's harming other people, there's really no... if the person is harming other people, especially in a substantial way, there's no charity or grace in bearing wrongs patiently for yourself if the harm is done to other people, right? You can bear wrongs patiently, wrongs done to you, but if the harm is to somebody else, then that's not something that you can look the other way about, right? If you see one brother acting, yelling at another brother, and you're just on the sidelines, you can't say, well, I'm just going to show charity and bear patiently. Well, bear what patiently? It wasn't directed at you. It was one brother yelling at another brother. Maybe you should do some fraternal correction for the yelling brother, right, if it wasn't warranted. Is this a virtue for everyone, right? Should everyone engage in fraternal correction? And St. Thomas has two hands on this. So on one hand, for the individual, recovery is of an erring brother by means of a simple warning, right? So in terms of my brother sins against me, this brother is doing something wrong, or sister, right? I can just simply give some advice, right? Give some correction. Pull them aside privately and try to get it through to them that what they're doing is not helping them or not helping others, right? Now, in terms of the common good, this is better set up for prelates, or another way of looking at it, those in authority, right? If you look at it that way, because you have the ability to give your opinion, but somebody who's in authority has the ability to give their opinion, make a ruling, and respond with action, right? This is for the sake of the common good, which is why the person has authority. The person has authority in order to regulate and to oversee and to bring forth the common good, right? That's their purpose. So, the person is particularly a public sinner, right? It's the job of the bishop or the politician, right, to make some type of public, admonish in some ways a bit more strictly. It doesn't mean that, well, I'm not a priest, I'm not an authority, therefore who am I to admonish? Well, for love of your brother out of charity, that's why we do it, right? If you're talking about your literal brother, right? Your literal brother or sister, well, why would you admonish them? Why would you do fraternal correction? Because you love them and you want them to be happy, right? That's why you do it. It doesn't have any authority, but you can show concern. Parents are another ones who have authority, right? School teachers have authority over students. So you have school teachers, parents, people in authority, they have the ability to have an opinion and to bring it to judgment. But for somebody who's an equal, right, we can't bring it to judgment, but we can still be concerned and show some type of fraternal correction. Now, can we show fraternal correction to the clergy or bishops or our superiors, right? Can we have correction to them? Yes and no, right? Yes and no. On one hand, through a matter of justice, right? We look at this injustice, right? An inferior has no jurisdiction or authority over a superior, so therefore fraternal correction is useless, right? Because you don't have any ability to do anything. A lot like Article 3 that we just covered, right? You don't have any authority. But in terms of charity, you can, right? You still can show correction to superiors or the clergy. But this should be done out of love, right? Out of charity, for one. And two, privately, right? It can be done privately. A good line here in the Summa is, a virtuous act needs to be moderated by due circumstances, right? So if you're going to correct a priest or bishop or somebody, you have to do it moderated by the circumstances. It follows that when a subject corrects his prelate, clergy, right, he ought to do so in a becoming manner, not with imprudence and harshness, but with gentleness and respect. Right? Well, that's something that's lost today. Right? The example that St. Thomas gives is as a son approaches a father, right, who we should honor. How do we do this? Well, we do it privately and without pride, right? With our own humility, we do this. You see this a lot on like Catholic social media, right? You see this, especially the people who are attacking Pope Francis or this bishop or another bishop or some priest, right? You see this all the time. Point out, who are you to, as a Catholic layman, to criticize the Pope, right? Who are you to chastise the Pope? Aren't you followers of the faith? You're not the Pope. So, you're not. Sometimes people say, well, fraternal correction, but you are not at the same level as this person within the church, right? So a bishop corrects another bishop. You as a layman don't really have the authority to correct a bishop, right? As a layman, right? You certainly as a layman don't have the authority to correct the Pope, right? Because you are not, in some ways, equal or brothers, right? You're not in the college of cardinals. You're not in the college of bishops. It's not in your position. But could you criticize the Pope, right? Could you offer fraternal correction to the Pope or your bishop? Sure. But not on Facebook, right? Somebody posts a story about a bishop in a Catholic forum and you make some nasty remark about this bishop. Is that fraternal correction? No, it's not fraternal correction. Pope Francis says something, you say something terrible about Pope Francis. Is that fraternal correction? No. Well, why isn't it? Well, because did you say it out of love for the bishop or for the Pope Francis? Or did you say it because you're angry, right? If you said it because you're angry, that's not charity, right? You can't pretend that's charity. Did you say it in a becoming manner? No. Did you say it prudently? No. Did you say it without harshness? No. Did you say it with gentleness and respect? No. Okay, then that's not fraternal correction, right? Did you do it privately and without pride? No. You put it on the internet, right? So a lot of people are claiming fraternal correction, but this is not fraternal correction, right? It's not fraternal correction. No. You have a private audience and you can have a heart-to-heart conversation. That's different, right? That's completely different. But yelling at people online is not helpful. Not fraternal correction. Now, can a sinner reprove somebody who's done something wrong, right? A wrongdoer. Can a sinner reprove a sinner? And we can look at it in three ways, right? One, the first way St. Thomas points out is, when a sinner reproves a sinner, and they do it in such a way that it tries to minimize their own sin, then no, right? This is the perfect example of remove the plank from your eye before you remove the splinter from your brother's eye, right? Here you are, that person, right, is the problem. Look at what that person's doing. You have your own stuff that you're doing, and you think that their stuff is worse than your stuff, right? In that regard, that is exactly what Jesus was talking about. And sinner, reprove yourself, right? First, take the board out of your own eye before you take the splinter out of your neighbor's eye, in terms of fraternal correction, right? In another way, we are all sinners, right? If we had to wait until the sinless one was around in order to make any type of fraternal correction, none of us would ever do fraternal correction, because none of us are perfect. So if we have to give fraternal correction as a sinner, right, how should we do it? And now number 2 and number 3, they tie together awfully close for me. From a psychological perspective, they tie together. You should not be one sinner should not be reproving another one in a way that becomes ostentatious, which it often does, right? Here you are on the internet reproving this one and condemning that one, and you have a lot of opinions about all these other ones, right? People have a lot of opinions. And you're doing it in an ostentatious way to get, to gather attention for yourself, right? How many people they have made a career, made a name for themselves on Twitter or other things by being outraged at what other people are doing, right? To make a spectacle of yourself, to get attention, to get followers, right? This is why I think it ties so much into number 3, because of pride, right? A prideful person is often ostentatious, right? It's hard to think of an ostentatious, humble person, right? It's an ostentatious, proud person, right? So we don't do fraternal correction as sinners with pride, right? Even if we were not a sinner, we still do fraternal correction with humility, right? With gentleness, as St. Thomas had just said in Article 4. Right. So when we do fraternal correction with humility, then we reprimand our neighbor as a fellow sinner, right? As a sinner to a sinner, I'm asking you, right? This is not working for you, right? This is the Dismas, the repentant thief on the cross, right? Why are you criticizing this man? We deserve our punishment. He's innocent. He doesn't deserve what was given to him. And Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise, right? By condemning yourself in your accusation, you're able to find forgiveness, right? It's because there's a humility in that, as a fellow sinner. Bishop Robert Barron often says things, as a sinner speaking to a sinner. I implore you, right? It's not that I have this perfectly, none of us do, but as fellow sinner, right? Let's live a better life, right? This is also very St. Paul, right? St. Paul is like that. Now, should we forbear correction? Right? Should we not do correction? Right? Should we withhold fraternal correction? And what St. Thomas points out here is, let's start backwards. From the individual, right? Just private citizen, right? Just me to you. Sometimes I might have to withhold my fraternal correction. Why? Because it's not a wise time. It's not a wise way of saying it. Sometimes we got to cool off, wait to a better situation. Sometimes we see it, note it. Maybe it's part of a trend, right? Maybe it's part of some bigger thing, right? Let me just wait and see how this plays out so that I can make a proper judgment, right? So that I can speak to them as one friend to another. Sometimes people do very bad things, but they're doing it because they're angry or scared or something else. So being able to properly diagnose the situation so that we can respond effectively is good, right? So sometimes we can forbear correction. Right? Now a prelate, right, somebody with authority, cannot forbear correction, right? You can. It's their job to make a judgment and to enforce the judgment for the sake of the common good, right? So, common thing on abortion, for example. Let's say you have a friend who says, "Oh, I'm pro-choice." Let's say it's a man, right? He's not going to have an abortion anytime soon. He's a man. Granted, he could get a woman pregnant, but assuming it's not in a position where it's a matter of life or death today, right? It's no life or death on the line today. Simply a matter of his thinking, right? I mean, you hear this and you think, okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that about him. But you don't have to respond in this second. You can listen, right? Ask some questions, right? Gather information. Why do they think this way? What's the reasoning? Why do they think this? And you can, you can address it more pastorally, right? You might be able to address it pastorally. Now a prelate, as a bishop, when it comes to an issue like abortion, right? The bishop needs to teach the teachings of the church, right? And whoever hears it, right? And you could say, well, people might be offended if they hear the church's teaching on abortion. Well, the bishop has to say it anyway, even if it offends people, right? They should say it in a clever way, a pastoral way, a smart way, right? It's not to upset people for the sake of upsetting people. It's to say it in a loving way, right? A charitable way. But you have to say it, right? You have to say it, even if it makes people unhappy, right? It doesn't mean you can't be, it doesn't mean you can't be smart about it, but you have to say it, right? Why? Because he has authority. The same thing with a parent, right? Why does if your 16-year-old that starts drinking, you can't say, I don't know about that. Let me think about that. Your 16-year-old's drinking, you punish them, right? You're a psych doctor, and a madman is going crazy, right? You give them an injection and subdue them and help them get back on the right path. You don't just let them continue, right? You have to make a judgment, right? This is the difference between a prelate and an individual. Is a prelate needs to make a judgment. An individual can kind of wait, right? Doesn't have to act. Now, should admonitions be private, right, before they become public? And this depends, right? Really, on one hand, if the sin is public, then it should be reproved, right, admonished publicly. Why? Because other people have heard it, right? So you have publicly scandalized the faithful. Therefore, you have to publicly say, that's not right. That's, again, on the abortion issue, I know it's a hot button one, but I think that it's a very fruitful example where it's quite clear, right? So if when a politician says, I'm a Catholic, and as a Catholic, I am for abortion, right? Make it even extreme. I am for late-term abortion as a Catholic. Well, if it's the Speaker of the House or the President of the United States who says, as a Catholic, I'm for late-term abortion, right, or I'm for abortion in general, well, now the church has to respond publicly. Why? Because you made a public statement about this, right? You have publicly declared that as a Catholic you are in favor of late-term abortion. Well, the bishop has to say, well, as the Catholic bishop, that is inconsistent with the Catholic faith, right? That way there's no scandal or confusion, right? It's, if a person privately held within their heart something, that's a different story. But if you have publicly done this, then okay, public response, right, to correct the record, right? Now, how about in terms of private sins? Well, it's better to be done privately, right? And this is where we jump into Matthew 18. Matthew 18, Jesus says, if somebody has sinned, first, talk to them privately. If they don't respond, bring a couple people, talk to them again. If that doesn't work, bring them before the community, right? And then if they still don't, then they get excommunicated, they get cut off. So this is the steps, right? The steps of how to do this. So typically you start privately, especially if it's a private citizen, private sin. Now, can you ignore private sin? Just because it's private, should you ignore it? And St. Thomas says no, right? Not out of charity, because out of charity, a person is destroying their soul. It's hard to call them your neighbor, to say, I love you, you're my neighbor. And they're doing something that might lead to their own damnation. Well, that's not a very loving thing to do, to allow somebody to be damned, right? So you should do something. Now, how about in terms of harming their good name, right? St. Thomas points this out. We might not even talk about this today. People are very openly destroying their own good name. But this matters at the time of St. Thomas. It should matter today. And he says we should do things to preserve a person's good name. We don't want to make things publicly unnecessarily. That's why we start privately and we move our way up. Why? Because if a person has lost their good name, then they might have despair, some type of despair, give up entirely, and then just give themselves to a life of sin. Right? At that point, you have nothing to lose, right? So you don't want to lose their good name. Also, it can harm others, right? Let's say President of the United States, make up a name, is very well loved, very respectable, a family person, right? Great. All presidents have been men so far, so I'll make him a man. A great husband, a great father, a great son, a great countryman. And it would turn out that he, after he's not president anymore and is in private life, he had been having an affair for all these years. Well, to make that public might harm the nation, right? It might harm our community, because now he wasn't just a person or a politician, he was a symbol of American unity, and he was a symbol of virtue, and now we've torn him down to being just an adulterer, right? For his own sake, he should repent, right? For the sake of his soul, he needs to repent. But for the sake of the nation, it would be better if we didn't know, right? How much we know about JFK now and Marilyn Monroe. How much would it have been better if we just didn't know that, right? It might be better. So it depends, right? But we should aim at privacy when necessary, right? And then lastly, should we use witnesses? Now this is another important one, right? It's just right from Matthew 18. If somebody is sinning, privately talk to them. If it doesn't work, bring witnesses, bring multiple people. And that should work, right? And St. Thomas calls it a middle ground, right? It is better to keep it private, but if you can't keep it private, it's better to bring the witnesses before you bring it all the way to the general public, right? Because once it's in the general public, there's no going back, right? The good name has been lost. But if you bring it to people who have already witnessed it, right? Let's say the person has become an alcoholic, right? I know this isn't sin, this is mental conditions, but as a classic example, I'll just make it for simplicity's sake. Well, these people who have seen him drunk, right? You're going to have an intervention with the person. Who do you bring to an intervention? People who are close to him in his life, who have witnessed the self-destructive behavior that the person has engaged in, right? Say, well, I came to your party and you threw up in my hat, right? And I invited you here, and then you drunk drove and you drove over my shrubs, and then you were invited here and you did, right? You bring examples from people who have witnessed it. So is bringing the witnesses together, is it destroying the person's good name? No, they've already witnessed it, right? They've already witnessed the destruction. You're using it, though, to force the person to do good, right? To reform. And it's better to do it with them than it is to the public. If the person still does not reform their life, then you bring it before the church and it becomes a bigger issue. But the goal is to avoid public embarrassment whenever possible, because it's not helpful to the individual, it's not good for their recovery from whatever they're dealing with, and it's not good for the community, right? Especially if the person is well respected in the community. Is it really helpful that we destroy their reputation? Not really, right? So in conclusion, fraternal correction is about charity. It is a matter of precept, right? It's part of the precept of charity, although not specifically laid out in one of the 10 Commandments or anything like that. It is binding to all, but people in authority have a different relationship to it than people who are not in authority. We can correct our superiors, but with humility and gentleness and in the proper manner. Sinners may correct cautiously, correct one another cautiously, right? Out of humility, without pride and ostentatiousness, and it's better to remove the board from your own eye first, right? To self-convict as a sinner would be okay. Try not to do fraternal correction in a way that will make it worse. It is better to do it privately or secretly. If you need to, though, you can add more people, only to the degree that it helps the person to recover to repent, right? It's to help the person repent and to protect the public, right? The general good. So that's it for the interior and exterior acts of charity. Next we will be moving on to vices, so I hope you enjoy that.